Tonight on Nation to Nation, the NDP's Blake Desjardins weighs in on the removal of Randy Boissonnault from cabinet for false claims of indigeneity.
Claiming to be Indigenous for the purpose of accessing funds that were set aside for Indigenous people, that is brutal. That is the highest form of racism.
The Liberal government is set to apologize this weekend for slaughtering more than 1,000 sled dogs in Nunavut decades ago.
The dog slaughter resulted in the fundamental way of life being disrupted in a way that's unimaginable.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. It's been a rough week for Randy Boissonnault. The Edmonton MP started the week as Minister of Employment, but by week's end he was forced to resign amidst false claims of indigeneity and fraud allegations against a company he co-owned. Another Edmonton MP, the NDP's Blake Desjardins, was amongst those calling for Boissonnault's immediate ouster from cabinet. He joins me today in studio. Welcome back to Nation Nation, Mr. Desjardins.
Very good to be here and always happy to speak directly to Indigenous folks.
Great. So as the NDP was calling for all week, Randy Boissonnault is now out of cabinet. That happened on Wednesday. What do you think about the way that the government handled this and the Prime Minister as well?
Well, I'm a bit nervous, to be very frank, in how the government handled this. They should have had the moral clarity from the beginning. At the very beginning, when the issue of a potential conflict of interest, that claim alone should be enough to remove a cabinet minister. The fact that you have a sitting minister also potentially directing his own company that had existing contracts or was bidding on contracts at the federal government is completely unacceptable and completely inappropriate. That alone should have been enough for the Prime Minister to say, you know what, we don't tolerate corruption, we don't tolerate conflicts of interest, you're going to the back of the House until we can figure this out. That should have been the first step of the Prime Minister. If he took ethics seriously, the fact that he let this prolong to the point where his corruption became so obvious and overt, in particular his abuse of the system when it came to claiming to be Indigenous for the purpose of accessing funds that were set aside for Indigenous people, that is brutal. That is the highest form of racism we have in the country. The ability to try to take one's identity for the very narrow and selfish purpose of advancing one's own prestige, one's own political ability, or one's own attempt to get federal contracts. All of it is unacceptable and has no place in the cabinet.
Now, of course, he's gone from cabinet, but still an MP, and also there's still, sort of concerns about his Indigenous heritage or what it is or what is not, and also, of course, this company. What do you think should happen now on this issue?
The facts are completely changing all the time. Randy doesn't tell us exactly who he is because maybe he doesn't know who he is himself. And that's a journey that a lot of Indigenous people take. But most Indigenous people don't begin that journey and then apply for federal contracts. Most people who want to reconnect to who they are doing it in a good way. They're talking to their family. They're expanding that discussion. They're finding out exactly who they are so they can regain that pride and ability to reconnect to their people. It isn't for the purpose of applying for a grant or applying for a contract. That's the case that we're dealing with right now, is the fact that he claimed to be Indigenous in an application to the government for a contract, even though he wasn't certain on who he is. He needs to take the time now, and I deeply encourage him, as he sits in the backbenches of the Liberal Party way in the Himalayas of Parliament, he should take that time to really reflect on who he is, what he stands for, and whether or not he can continue to be the Member of Parliament for Edmonton Centre. When I think of the people in Edmonton Centre right now, particularly Indigenous people, they're embarrassed, they're angry, they're upset that something like this could have happened and gone on for so long. It's time that he reflect on the very deep wounds and pain he's inflicted upon the Indigenous community.
Now, aside from what he should do, this is a serious issue, right, in universities and other, the arts. And this is, of course, this is Parliament, right? And obviously he's used this to maybe further himself, things like that. What do you think the penalties or the consequences should be for this type of behavior?
Oh, this is something we need to figure out in Canada. That's the biggest question I have. We need to have severe consequences for when people attempt to use Indigenous identity for the purpose of advancing their own careers or getting money. That is the worst form of racism that persists in Canada. Academia, for example. We just had two young women in Nunavut charged, sent to prison for 3 years for stealing money from Indigenous students that they claimed to be Inuit to get access to that funding, and they took it. That is completely inappropriate. I agree with that heavy penalty of 3 years in prison. When it comes to cases like this, when it comes to cases where we aren't sure of the facts yet, we need to actually create a framework of ensuring that people lose access to whatever they've benefited from through the course of claiming to be Indigenous. We have to remove those benefits, honors, honorifics, and processes. And I'll tell you why we do that. We do that because if we do not have a heavy hand and penalize what is a terrible crime in my eyes, which is identity fraud against Indigenous people, we run the risk of allowing this to continue to take place and allowing it to even get worse, meaning more people would start to claim Indigenous identity, saying, it's just a slap on the wrist anyway. The benefit way outweighs the penalty. We must ensure that the penalty is so great that no one dares to ever think of doing this ever again. And if you are a pretendian, we will find you. They have to know that. We aren't going to stop looking. We will continue looking, and we will find you, and we will persecute you to the greatest extent that justice demands.
Now, we kind of talked about this in the lead-up. I personally had not really heard about his claims of being Indigenous. I knew problems with the company that he had and that until it sort of blew up this week. You're obviously in Edmonton. When did you first hear of these stories of maybe false claims or changing identities?
Oh, this has been an issue that I think many Indigenous people right across Edmonton have had to deal with in the past. And it's very difficult as well. This issue existed prior to my engagement in national politics, as a matter of fact. I'd understood that Randy Boissonnault was part of the Indigenous Liberal Caucus in the former Parliament before I was elected. And in that role, he was a member of a caucus of other Indigenous people in the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party themselves identified Randy Boissonnault as Indigenous in their communications, saying they have this many Indigenous people in their cabinet. That, of course, raised a lot of questions when you do that. Community members in Edmonton raised their eyes and said, well, what nation claims him? Who is he? And you know, and many of the viewers would know this, Indigenous people, we're proud to talk about where we're from. When someone says, hey, where are you from? What's your name? I say, I'm Blake Desjardins. And they, oh, I know those Desjardins. Which ones? Where are you from? I say, oh, I'm from Fishing Lake. Oh, I know you're Musham. I know these people. That's the regular way that this happens. We love to connect with our relatives. We love to connect with who we are, and we're proud of it. When he was unable to answer those questions in earnest, that's when I think the red flag started going up. Well, who is he? Then he responded in Parliament, and he would say things like, my great-grandmother was a full-blooded Cree woman. Today we know that's not the case. That was a lie. He went on to say things like, well, I'm a non-status adoptive Métis now. And this was more recent. There's no such thing as status Métis, let alone Métis people who are adoptive Métis or non-status adoptive Métis. These are artificial titles. And when we see this kind of movement, we call it race shifting. That's the first red flag that we should have when addressing pretendians. This race shifting, in order to create ambiguity, in order to create questions, is how they defend themselves for so long. That's how this was able to continue for near a decade.
Now, I was led to believe that parties have vetting processes, and most people believe that biographies are true and things that this sort of thing shouldn't happen. Do parties have to do a better job of vetting this kind of stuff or policing it before it gets to the extent that someone's actually a cabinet minister in a government?
I believe that decision largely rests with the individual first and foremost. Rather than lending that question to institutions like parties or institutions like the police, Indigenous people or people in Canada who are attempting to reconnect with who they are must know that there's a process to doing that work. You must understand who you are and ask the questions of what you don't know of yourself in order to get to the point of identifying that way. In Canada's common law, there's 3 tests. I don't necessarily agree with Canada's common law on this, but I agree for the purposes of this that there's at least 3 questions one must ask themselves in order to self-identify, and are really important guidelines, I think, for institutions and even the House of Commons and political parties. One must self-identify. Yes, I am Blake Desjardins. I identify as a Métis person. 2, you must belong to the historic community of that nation. I have ancestors. We could have a big genealogy here to show you. My dad, my mom are from Fishing Lake, or grandparents are from Fishing Lake, or whoever. That's how that would go to determine who is a historical ancestor. And the last question is, does the contemporary community accept you? That's a really tough one for a lot of the pretendians. They can't get that last one. They can maybe do the first 2, and we've seen instances of producing those fake records, like the instance that was charged in Nunavut of forging documents in order to get that second question answered. But they can't get that last question answered. And so that should be the red flag when someone asks you, what nation do you belong to? Especially if you're going to be running in politics, they should have the courage, and they should know and have the very clear response of saying where they're from. I am Blake Desjardins. I'm from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement, and I'm very proud to say it. I'm very proud of the Indigenous people who know that and know where they come from. And I'm very proud of those who don't know where they come from and are reconnecting. That's an important group to acknowledge as well, that do not abuse the system and go through that process and come out better for it.
Now, sort of on that, we get a lot of, I'm sure you've heard of them too, people that, allegations of people that are sitting in the civil service, public servants that are claiming to be Indigenous. What do you think the government should do about that situation?
Oh, I called on the minister months ago when this first came up about Indigenous procurement. I was on the Public Accounts Committee. I was on the committee that audits the government. I look at all the money, I look at all the expenditures of the government, and I am part of the team that's responsible for uncovering some of the worst corruption cases in the country. ArriveCAN, SDTC, something we're dealing with right now, and this file, the abuse of Indigenous procurement, or in other words, the abuse of programs designed for Indigenous people to get money. We just heard from the minister quietly this week that 1,100 companies were deregistered from the pre-approved Indigenous companies list. 1,100. What were they doing before we brought this up? The fact that we had over 1,000 companies that were ineligible for Indigenous funding were part of a pre-approved list. And so I asked the government months ago to audit their lists, produce questions that would create confidence in who is Indigenous, and ensure that they are fully in compliance with the act that says you must be you have to be more than 51% Indigenous owned, and you need to have over 33% of your workforce as Indigenous. 1,100 companies failed that test. The government needs to expand their audit, though, not just on those businesses. They need to expand that work, and I call on the Auditor General, actually, the independent Commissioner of Parliament, to investigate this issue. Where and when civil servants are claiming to be Indigenous, we have to get the Auditor General, who is the top official who's responsible for investigating these kinds of things, into the government so she can get access to the documents, get access to the people, talk to them about who they are, so we can come to a solution on finally ending this serious and very disgusting kind of and dangerous form of racism that continues to persist in Canada, and worst of all, right here in Ottawa.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, but as always, thanks for joining us to talk about this very serious and important issue.
Thank you so much, Fraser.
Up next, we'll talk to Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Gary Anasandagri about an upcoming apology to the people of Inuvik for government-sanctioned slaughter of sled dogs decades ago. Welcome back. Ottawa says it will soon offer both an apology and financial compensation to the people of Nunavik, an area where Inuit people live in northern Quebec. It comes as recognition of the harms created when more than 1,000 sled dogs were slaughtered in the 1950s and 60s by the RCMP, Hudson Bay Company, and other agencies. The Inuit relied on the sled dogs for both transportation and hunting. And here today to talk about this is Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Gary Anasandagri, who joins us from his office on Parliament Hill. Welcome back to Nation to Nation.
Great to be back, Fraser. This is a historic moment for the Inuit as well as Canada, as we formally apologize for the impacts of the dog slaughter that took place in the 1950s and 60s in Nunavik. As you know, this has impacted generations of Inuit in the region, and I hope the actions of the Government of Canada will give some relief as the nation moves on.
Yeah, I guess just following up on that, can you tell us a little bit about why at this particular time, I guess the government decided to offer this apology and compensation?
We've been working on this with Makivik for a number of years. In fact, the Makivik have been part of advocacy for this for the last 30 years or so. The President, Pita Atami, has been personally involved, and many survivors across the region have been actively pursuing this. Several years ago, the province of Quebec and the Sûreté de Quebec made a similar gesture, and then the RCMP, there was an RCMP report that came out as well, and I think we're on a path to reconciliation, and right now this is a critical moment for us to acknowledge past harms. While an apology and the acknowledgement that I will do over this weekend will not bring back the impacted lives or change what's happened, it does clear the way for us to build on this relationship and to ensure that the Inuit going forward in Makivik and Nunavik are able to move forward in a manner that acknowledges the harms done and are able to build a future that embraces the work that we've been doing and ensure that the ways of life are continued.
Now, maybe you could just, we understand this has been had very large impacts on the Inuit community in Nunavik. Maybe you can explain a bit from your understanding, just some of the scars, I guess, it left on the community after these dogs were slaughtered and what sort of effect it had on communities.
Sure, the landscape of the North is quite unique, and oftentimes the dog sleds were the primary source of transportation that enabled the Inuit to hunt, to fish, and to sustain their way of life, including transportation. The dog slaughter resulted in the fundamental way of life being disrupted in a way that's unimaginable, and essentially Inuit men and women, particularly men, lost their self-determination over their livelihood and their way of life. And that's impacted both in an emotional sense, but also has caused enormous harms to the family structure. And in the last several decades since that happened, many people have passed on who were severely impacted. There is intergenerational trauma that has resulted from the dog slaughter. The ways of life have drastically changed, and we know that, especially in the North, as climate change is real, this is another element of the impact of colonialism on the Inuit, and we believe that the steps that we're going to take this weekend are going to be critical to acknowledge those harms and to really support the community in the healing process.
So I'd like to move on to another topic that, of course, you've been involved in, and that's with the settling of a number of specific claims in the Treaties 5, 6, and 10 areas of Western Canada. They're also known as the Cows and Plows settlements, and you've been doing a number over the last few months. Could you maybe just give us a brief update on that?
We are moving along on resolving Cows and Plows. As you know, there's an expedited process in these treaties, treaty regions, to be able to resolve past wrongs. Essentially, the treaties 4, 5, 6, and 10 had components in the treaty that essentially required Canada to provide seedlings and other agricultural components so that their food security as well as employment and sustainability on the land was secured by what we colloquially call as Cows and Plows. We have, since 2022, been working on an expedited manner to resolve this through the specific claims process. Thus far, we are about $1.9 billion in resolutions, and virtually on a weekly basis, Fraser, I'm signing off on new resolutions, and I'm glad to report that just last month I was able to do several communities in northern Saskatchewan and in Alberta. Cumberland House, for example, is one of those communities, and it was just heartening to see that we're resolving something that has really been hurtful and essentially has resulted in disparity between First Nations and non-First Nations, and this is part of the acts of reconciliation or reconciliation, as we say, that will enable us to move forward.
Okay, and another thing I'd like to just ask you briefly about is the Residential Schools Documents Advisory Committee We talked to the chair, Cadmus Delorme, about 6 weeks ago, I guess, or so, and they sort of at that time suspended their work because they didn't have sufficient funding to do it. Can you give us an update on that, or if the money's been replaced, or where things are at?
I have a high regard for the work of the advisory committee. What I can suggest is that we do have funding that is available until the end of the fiscal year, which is March 31st. And of course, like any budgetary process, we will be seeking funds in the upcoming budget to be able to support that work. So I do think the resources that are available right now should be utilized to its fullest form, and we look forward to the work that they do. It is critically important, but unfortunately our funding cycles are such where they are not available. Certainty is not available right now, but if you look at the way our government's been working since 2015, it is about ensuring that records, for example, or search for records are adequately funded, and there's long-term availability of those funds. So I'm really comfortable in saying that the work should continue, and we will look forward to supporting that work in the long term.
All right. Well, we'll have to end it there for time purposes. But as always, thanks for joining us today, Minister Anna Sandegri.
Thank you, Fraser.
APTN News will be in Nunavik in northern Quebec for the Apology, and we'll have more on that in coming days. After the break, we'll have more on Nation to Nation. Welcome back. Before we go, the NDP's critic for Indigenous Affairs, Laurie Idlout, was once again pressing the Liberal government in the House of Commons earlier this week on fixing the lack of clean drinking water in Nunavut. The Prime Minister answered and put the blame back on the NDP.
11 of the 25 communities I represent have experienced boil water advisories this year. That is almost half. Even the UN Special Rapporteur slammed this government for ignoring their obligation to ensure clean drinking water. The Liberals have failed. Nunavut children, families, and whole communities should not have to worry about drinking water. When will this Liberal government finally invest in Nunavut so everyone can have the clean drinking water they deserve?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
To my colleague, I agree. We need to move forward on protecting clean water, on delivering. That's why we're asking the NDP to stop slow-walking the Clean Water Bill, to work with us to get it through this House so we can actually deliver the water that Canadians need from coast to coast to coast, including in Nunavut.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.